Hello and welcome to Success is Never Accidental. And this year we're trying a different format where I'm going to have short sessions with experts about specific topics. Well, today's first because today I'm actually interviewing my husband, Rodney Peyton, who is very well known in the field of medical education. So hi Rodney, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, haven't seen you all day, yeah.
So Rodney, in your book, Appraisal and Assessment in Medical Education, one of the things you talk about is the importance of constructive feedback, whether that's after a procedure or in the context of supervision. Why is feedback so important, and how do people give it in a way where it can be heard?
I think that what you've just said there is important, in a way that can be heard. Feedback a lot of times is saying, this is what you did, this is what you should have done, and you need to do better the next time. And supervision, if you ask people, they get in their head, this is about me being told off. I'm going for supervision, so somebody is going to go through my notes and tell me what I did wrong and how I should improve. Comes from school, I think. Proper feedback is there to try and motivate people, to help people understand any holes in their knowledge, to help them to grow and develop, and to motivate them to do so. By continually telling people they don't know what they're doing or pointing out mistakes, that's the big problem.
So is there a formula, is there a framework whereby we can give supervision in a more helpful way?
There is indeed, and it's called Pendleton's rules. It's been around an awful long time. And depends whether you're talking to a group or an individual, but let's talk about the individual. The first thing you need to understand is everybody's doing their best with the resources they've been given. So the thing to do is to accentuate what they've done well and to say, well look, over the past year, over the past few months, or in this case, what do you think went well? What were you happy with? How did that work for the patient or the client? And what was benefit to the client of what you did? And that helps them to feel good inside. That helps them to feel, yeah, I didn't do everything wrong. I have helped this client has moved on, and that's because of what I did. So that gets them motivated.
So we're working, like Buckingham would say, from a strengths-based foundation.
From a strengths-based, absolutely right. And then if you've something else, instead of saying, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, you turn around and say, well, if you were to do that again, would you have changed anything? Or, given what happened over this year, what do you wish you'd done and what would you like to have done better? And that like to have done better doesn't say you did anything wrong, but it says, could you do it even better? And that word even can be very, very important.
I love that word even, because there's no judgment then.
Absolutely, no judgment. So you're saying, what went well? And how can you make that even better? What was the outcome of the thing that you did? And then what would you improve on? How would you change? How would you do it? Because if it comes from inside, they're liable to do it. If it comes from outside, and especially if there's more than 2 or 3 points, people just get lost and say, this is just, and it's coming from somebody else, it's coming from outside, you're telling me what to do.
So this is really more of a coaching approach, where you're encouraging people to come up with their own answers.
And most people are professional, that's the point. They understand and they know, and to give them the chance to show what they know, to give them the chance to understand what they need to do move forward is far more powerful than just telling them what to do.
And it's so empowering, isn't it, if you coach them in a way where they can actually come up with the answers and problem solve for themselves.
And sometimes, maybe you're not in the same position or in the same division, in the same, industry, but you can still ask that question. They are the experts. They come up with changes, some that you might not have even thought of, and that's very powerful if they can come up with it themselves. And they may know more than you do.
And then how do you make sure that you hold them accountable for positive change going forward?
Well, then you want to set goals. You want to say, so what you're saying is you want to do this, this and this. How would that look? How will you know that you've been successful in doing this? So in the next 3 cases, 4 cases, you're going to try this approach. So how are we going to know what success looks like? And by knowing what success looks like, then you can start again. So what went well? What were the successes you had this time? Use that word, the successes you had this time. And how did that feel when you got there? And what would you do in the future? So setting those goals based on what they have brought up. And then you can hold them accountable, not by saying you are accountable, but saying, how did that go? What went well, etc. So it's a recycling of the same process.
I love that. So essentially what we're saying is that feedback needs to come from a strengths-based approach where we encourage folks to actually identify what went well and what could they do even better next time. That encourages a conversation about options. It's relaxed, it's empowering, and then we help them to hold themselves accountable for progress going forward. And of course that can be built into supervision. So Rodney, another thing that you cover in the book is the importance of not postponing difficult conversations and actually giving a framework about how to approach them. Now we all know sometimes other people see traits in us that we don't actually see in ourselves. And one of the common things that comes across in complaints about services, it's not actually a complaint about the service so much as people may not have liked the particular service provider, be that the doctor, the social worker, the mental health profession, whatever. Tell us a little bit about, first of all, why it's important for supervisors and senior people to have these difficult conversations, and then how can we go about it in a way that's effective?
Yes, this is an interesting one because it is difficult to have upfront complications, especially about emotional issues with people, because they feel attacked, they feel put down, and yet they don't understand or they can't see to begin with how that or their attitude has affected somebody else. Now, if it's acute, if it's just happened, we talked about Pendleton's rules before. You slightly change those, and when it's obvious that an argument has occurred or something, the first question is not, well, how did you do, what went well, but it's the first one is, what happened? Mm-hmm. Let's just explore what happened. Name it. What happened there? You know this happened, so why do you think it happened? To see if they've got insight. Because if they have insight, then you can use that and say, well, you know what happened and you know the effect. So how would you avoid doing that in the future? And by doing it that way, you help somebody who is open to change to move forward and to change without feeling upset and hurt and got at themselves. And that's important. So that makes that conversation a bit easier. But there are times when things come up that people just ignore. And they say, well, that's just the way they act, or something like that. So you've got to think carefully about this. The number one thing is this of importance? If the complaint is like, I didn't like the colour of their tie and something like that, is it really worth getting into that conversation with? If it is, then you've got to get specific on what. So you open the conversation as, well, what happened there? And you have got to be clear in your mind specifically what happened. Not as a general, they didn't like you, they or whatever, but a specific time in the case. The specific consequence
So that's really
of that.
important then, if you're the person receiving a complaint, that you get clarity about what's the specific nature of the complaint.
Yes.
So that's a good lesson too.
You must get specific, because generalities like they don't like you or you always do this, or that's not true. And as soon as that's not true, that gives them an in to come back at you, and they're more interested in defending than they are of listening. But if you give something specific, and the biggest thing is, what was the consequence of it? What was the consequence in terms of their work, their ability to work with somebody else? What was the consequence on the person that they had this conversation or this work with? So you need to know, is it worth it? You need to know what specifically we're talking about, what's the consequence, and then what will be the consequence. You can say, if this continues that way, what is going to be the consequence? First of all, to your practice, to your work, and then what do you think is going to be the consequence to you if this does not change?
So you're back to that kind of coaching style where you're helping them to elicit the consequences rather than you telling them.
So that they feel it. They're not being told, and they realize, well, if this continues and we get multiple complaints about this particular issue, how am I going to handle that? You see? And then they see that's coming forward. Now, the power of that is you then get them accountable. They understand the consequence to their client. They understand the consequence for them in their workplace if this keeps going. Then when you talk to them in 2 or 3 months to see if this has changed, you can say, remember we had this conversation and you said to me and you agreed to. And that's very powerful, because you're not saying, I'm telling you. You're saying you agreed to do something and you haven't followed through. So you see, that puts it back on them. And that's very important and very powerful. You're not saying, you can say, I'm disappointed because you said you would do this and you're agreeing you did not. And that is how you get, then I have to write it up and I have to go further. So by doing it that way, the acute phase, we say, what went wrong? How can we avoid this? Or more chronically, to understand if it's important, to understand what is the consequence have been, and what's going to be a consequence to them if they continue in that vein.
So really, just to summarise, you're saying when it comes to having difficult conversations, sooner rather than later, be very, very clear and specific about what the issue is, and then use a coaching style to encourage insight from the person whose behaviour or whatever needs to be changed, and then hold them accountable for that. And also, I think what you're saying there is anticipate that positive change is likely.
And if it's not, you're putting it there and saying, you promised to do this, or you said you would do this, so what happened?
The only other thing I would add to that in my experience is very often it's the impact on the team that person belongs to that can be really, really critical. And as a leader, it's very important that you take charge so that it's not the team then having to deal with it, or actually sitting back wondering why the leader hasn't dealt with it.
It's part of the job of a leader.
So great insights. Thank you so much.